As the cold, gray dawn broke, a sense of dread enveloped me like the thick mist that shrouded our old lake house. The eerie silence hung heavy in the air, the kind that often precedes a tempest. Inside, my inner turmoil mirrored the disquieting stillness outside. I am Eliza, and this is the tale of the darkest recesses of my life, concealed beneath the deceptive tranquility of everyday existence. It began imperceptibly, so subtly that I initially mistook it for misplaced kindness. My stepfather, Martin, had gradually entered our lives, filling the void left by my father's tragic passing. We lost Dad in a horrific car accident that seemed to freeze time, forever altering the course of our lives. My mother, Diana, vulnerable and longing for companionship, had welcomed Martin with an openness that perhaps invited more than mere companionship. Martin, the owner of the largest bookstore in town, was a charming and intellectual man, a stark contrast to my father's vibrant energy. I was 16 when he moved in, bringing with him an air of quiet authority. At first, it was the small things. Insistent knocks on my bedroom door late at night under the guise of checking in, or the way his gaze lingered a little too long. But soon, those small things morphed into an unsettling presence I could no longer ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the whispering pines surrounding our home, Martin knocked on my door. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and his patchouli cologne, a fragrance that would soon haunt me. My mother, a deep sleeper due to the sleeping pills she took to numb her grief, was a detail Martin exploited with precision. "Eliza, just making sure you're safe," he whispered, his voice a sibilant hiss in the darkness, too close for comfort. The room was unnaturally still, the silence charged with unspoken intentions. At that moment, I could no longer deny the truth. His motives were far from paternal. As time passed, the late-night visits grew more frequent. My room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage where I was compelled to play a role I never sought. On the nights he came to my door, I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding against the quiet of the house, as I feigned sleep through his whispered words and lingering stares. His manipulation extended beyond the unsettling visits, permeating every aspect of my life, dictating my freedoms with bargains I never wished to make. "You can go to the dance, Eliza, but what will you give me in return?" he would ask, his words coded in feigned benevolence, masking their sinister intent. I longed to confide in my mother, to rouse her from her medicated slumber, but Martin was always 2 steps ahead, his public persona impeccable. To the outside world, he was a generous man who had stepped into the role of a father for a grieving widow and her daughter. But beneath this facade lurked a darkness that clawed at me, a secret that threatened to suffocate the truth out of my life. One fateful night, the inevitable occurred. The door creaked open, and his silhouette loomed in the doorway. My breath caught in my throat as I lay motionless, eyes tightly shut, silently praying for dawn. His footsteps approached, each one a countdown to my nightmare. "Eliza, are you awake?" he murmured, and I felt the bed dip under his weight. His hand brushed my hair, a faint gesture of affection that made my skin crawl. I remained still, a statue, as he continued his charade. The darkness pressed in on me, thick with the scent of tobacco and patchouli, now twisting my stomach. He moved closer, his breath hot against my skin. "You know, Eliza, a little gratitude would go a long way," he whispered, his words a serpent's hiss. I wanted to scream, to run, but where could I go? Outside, the mist clung to the lake house like a shroud, and inside, I was trapped in a nightmare of Martin's creation. His presence lingered long after he left, and I lay there, the echoes of his whispers mingling with the ghostly calls of the lake at night. I knew I had to do something, anything to escape. But first, I needed to gather the strength to face the morning light, to wear the mask of normalcy while inside, I crumbled under the weight of my silent screams. Days blurred into one another, each moment a silent testament to the dread that filled my waking hours. My relationship with my mother had become a fragile thread, stretched taut by secrets and silent cries. She was lost in her own grief, clinging to Martin's presence like a lifeline, unable to see the monster lurking behind his comforting smiles. The true turning point came on a suffocating summer evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in strokes of blood red and purple. Martin had proposed a celebration, marking the days that were supposed to symbolize my steps toward adulthood but felt more like shackles. "Eliza, tomorrow is a big day, isn't it? Your college registration," Martin remarked casually as we sat at the dinner table, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine creeping in through the open window. "Yes," I replied, my voice a whisper, afraid to unleash the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. "And have you thought about my offer? The car, the tuition fees?" His voice was velvet, but his eyes, sharp as knives, cut through the pretense. I nodded, feeling the walls close in. "I have. And?" He pressed, leaning in, his breath tainted with the familiar stench of tobacco and patchouli. I swallowed hard, my hands clenched in my lap. "I accept." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. "Good girl," he smiled, his eyes glinting with a triumph that made my stomach churn. "But remember, everything has its price." That night, as I lay in bed, the echoes of our conversation ringing in my ears, I knew what awaited me. The dread settled deep in my bones, a constant companion as the shadows danced on my ceiling, mocking my despair. At midnight, like a scene from a grotesque play, my bedroom door creaked open. Martin's silhouette paused in the frame, a dark blot against the pale moonlight. "Are you ready, Eliza?" His voice was a soft murmur, but to me, it roared through the silence. I didn't respond, paralyzed by fear and resignation. As he approached, the familiar scent of tobacco and patchouli enveloped me, a noxious cloud marking the death of my innocence. He sat beside me, his weight a reminder of the reality I faced. "It will be like those romantic novels you love," he whispered, his voice a cruel mimicry of tenderness. But this was no romance, it was a theft, a violation dressed as a transaction. His hands, those of a thief, reached out, and I turned my face away, retreating into the darkest corners of my mind, a feeble attempt to escape the present torment. The night stretched on, each moment an eternity. As he began to violate me, I made a tremendous effort to disconnect my mind from my body. I tried to imagine myself in my safe place, and in that way, I managed to ensure that the experience only remained recorded in my memory as a series of flashes. In all of them, I see him above me or behind me, his hands always holding mine, his eyes wide open, scanning me as if he wanted to photograph me with his gaze to preserve that moment forever. When he was satisfied, or perhaps when his vital forces could no longer support him, he finally left me lying motionless. When dawn broke, it brought no relief, only the stark, harsh light of reality. Martin left with a promise, a reminder of our deal, the car and the tuition, the price of my silence and submission. I rose from the bed, a shell of myself, my body bruised by the weight of his desires and my spirit hollowed out. I walked to the mirror, barely recognizing the reflection that greeted me, red eyes, a pale complexion, a person I hardly knew. The next day, as promised, Martin drove me to the dealership to pick up the car, the vehicle that symbolized both my escape and my chains. As we drove in silence, the distance between us was filled with the heavy scent of his cologne and the unspoken truths that hung in the air like a thick fog. When I stepped into the car, a new resolve settled within me. This car was not just a symbol of Martin's control, but also my ticket to freedom. I would drive to university, to a new life far from the lake house and its ghosts. As I drove off, leaving Martin in the rearview mirror, I promised myself that this was not just an escape, but the beginning of a journey towards reclaiming my life, my voice, and my future. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, I felt a spark of hope flicker within me, a defiant flame that whispered of new beginnings and the promise of healing.